What if one of the most defining conflicts of the 20th century, a war that divided nations, families, and ideologies, never happened? How would lives, politics, and global power have shifted in its absence? What if Vietnam, a nation torn apart by war, had been spared decades of devastation? Imagine a world without the Vietnam War, no massive protests ripping through American streets, no draft tearing families apart, no images of soldiers trudging through dense jungles, and no bitter national divide leaving scars that still linger today. How would history have changed? What would America, Vietnam, and the world look like today? Stick around, because the answers might surprise you. The Vietnam War was never just about Vietnam. It was a proxy battlefield in the Cold War, a global tug-of-war between the United States and the Soviet Union, where smaller nations often became pawns in larger ideological struggles. But if the war had been avoided, would the Cold War have found another stage? During the 1950s, America's containment policy aimed to stop the spread of communism at all costs, driven by fears outlined in the domino theory, which emerged from events like the fall of China to communism in 1949 and the Korean War. A concept suggesting that if one nation fell to communism, its neighbors would inevitably follow, destabilizing entire regions. Vietnam became a focal point, shaped by Cold War strategies and the urgency of containment. But what if the US had chosen a different stage for this ideological battle? Without Vietnam, the US might have turned its attention to other regions, Africa, South America, or even the Middle East, where conflicts like the Algerian War of Independence and Cold War-backed coups were already shaping global dynamics. Imagine it like a game of whack-a-mole. As one region stabilized, another could become a hotspot, such as Angola or Chile, where communist movements were already bubbling. Imagine this. Instead of helicopters over Vietnamese rice paddies, we might have seen covert operations in Cuba or open warfare in Central America, highlighting how the Cold War found battlegrounds across the globe. The Cold War balance may have shifted in unpredictable ways, possibly drawing the US and Soviet Union into even deadlier confrontations. But that's just the geopolitical stage. The ripple effects don't stop there, as they reach deep into the cultural and emotional fabric of American society. The Vietnam War left deep scars on American society. It divided families, inspired massive protests, and reshaped the nation's culture. Without the war, the 1960s might have looked very different. The counterculture movement, fueled in large part by anti-war sentiment, may have taken a less explosive form. The protests that defined a generation might have focused on other causes, like civil rights or environmentalism. Imagine a 1960s America where Martin Luther King Jr.'s message wasn't overshadowed by anti-war marches. Could the civil rights movement have gained even more momentum, perhaps accelerating key legislative victories like the Voting Rights Act of 1965, or leading to broader social change earlier in the decade? Without the distraction of Vietnam, could issues like racial justice or economic inequality have taken center stage in national politics? And what about Lyndon B. Johnson? Without the burden of Vietnam, his presidency might have been defined by the success of his Great Society programs, Medicare, Medicaid, and civil rights, instead of a war many saw as unwinnable. Perhaps poverty would have declined faster, and racial inequalities might have been addressed more effectively. But here's the twist. Without Vietnam, the military-industrial complex, the powerful coalition of defense contractors and armed forces, might not have grown as rapidly. Would America have avoided the hyper-militarization that shaped the late 20th century? Or would Cold War rivalries in places like Korea or the Middle East have driven similar escalations? Or would another conflict have taken its place? Hold that thought as we turn to Southeast Asia. Vietnam, a nation devastated by decades of fighting, might have seen a very different future without the war. A peaceful unification under communism, negotiated settlements, or even a continued division could have spared millions of lives, like diffusing a ticking time bomb before it explodes. The war's destruction didn't just affect Vietnam, it destabilized the entire region, triggering waves of refugees and humanitarian crises that reshaped international aid policies for decades. Organizations like the UNHCR, United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, expanded their efforts in Southeast Asia, laying the groundwork for modern refugee assistance frameworks that continue to influence global policies today. Neighboring countries like Cambodia and Laos were pulled into the conflict, suffering deeply as a result. In Cambodia, the destabilization eventually led to the rise of the Khmer Rouge and one of history's deadliest genocides, while Laos endured relentless bombings that still leave unexploded ordnance threatening civilians today. Without the Vietnam War, the Khmer Rouge's rise in Cambodia might never have happened, potentially saving millions from genocide. And economically? A stable Vietnam could have integrated into the global economy far earlier, acting like a rising tide lifting all boats in Southeast Asia, joining the ranks of powerhouses like Thailand and Malaysia while bolstering ASEAN, Association of Southeast Asian Nations, as a stronger economic bloc, fostering regional cooperation and economic growth. Picture bustling cities like Hanoi and Ho Chi Minh City emerging as economic hubs decades earlier, transforming the global trade network with their strategic location and becoming integral to global supply chains. Vietnam's role in global trade might have transformed the region's economic landscape entirely. But what about the soldiers who fought? Their stories take us into the heart of emotional fallout. For Americans who lived through it, the Vietnam War was more than headlines and battle reports. It was personal. Nearly 3 million Americans served, and over 58,000 never came home, while hundreds of thousands returned with physical and psychological scars that shaped debates around veterans' care for decades. Entire families were changed forever. Fathers, brothers, and sons left for Vietnam and never returned, leaving behind empty chairs at dinner tables and unanswered questions that haunted generations. Without the war, those lives would not have been lost, and the absence of such profound emotional scars might have reshaped how America viewed its role in global conflicts, focusing more on healing than division. Additionally, the Vietnam Veterans Memorial, an iconic symbol of loss and healing, might never have been needed, altering how the US remembers and honors its fallen soldiers. Imagine a generation of young men and women growing up without the trauma of war. The term Vietnam Syndrome, symbolizing America's reluctance for prolonged conflicts, a term rooted in the nation's struggle to reconcile military intervention with public opinion, wouldn't be in our vocabulary. Would America have entered future conflicts, like the Gulf War or Iraq, with less hesitation? Or would the absence of Vietnam's lessons have led to earlier missteps in US foreign policy? Or would the absence of Vietnam's lessons have led to a different global image, one where military strategies lacked the caution born from past failures? The absence of the war might also have changed how we view patriotism and dissent. The heated debates over loyalty and protest could have taken a back seat, allowing cultural dialogues to evolve more harmoniously, perhaps focusing instead on shared national goals like space exploration or environmental conservation. But history has a way of filling voids, doesn't it? What conflicts might have taken Vietnam's place? Globally, the Vietnam War reshaped alliances and rivalries. It strained relations between the Soviet Union and China, forcing them into an uneasy competition for influence over North Vietnam, particularly as Maoist and Soviet communist ideologies began to diverge during the 1960s. Without the Vietnam War, this rivalry might have played out differently, possibly delaying the Sino-Soviet split or altering their global strategies. Without the war, their Cold War dynamics might have taken a different path, potentially delaying the Sino-Soviet split or leading to unforeseen conflicts as their global strategies evolved. For the United States, the war's absence might have meant a stronger focus on the space race, domestic reforms, or even alternative military engagements. Would the Soviet Union have collapsed earlier without the economic burden of supporting North Vietnam? Would the US have turned its attention to other theaters, intensifying conflicts elsewhere? The possibilities are endless, but one thing is clear. The Vietnam War's absence would have created a cascade of changes across the globe, touching every corner of society. So, what if the Vietnam War had never happened? The world we know today would look vastly different. A quieter 1960s, a stronger civil rights movement, a more stable Southeast Asia, or perhaps new conflicts would have erupted to fill the void, leaving us in an even more precarious world. History doesn't give us do-overs, but it does leave us with questions that challenge how we see the past and imagine the future. What do you think? Would a world without the Vietnam War be better, or would the challenges of the Cold War simply have played out elsewhere? Let us know in the comments, and don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell for more deep dives into the history that could have been.